My brother was laughing at something his girlfriend said when the notary stamped the last page. I was standing by the window with a coffee I hadn't touched, watching my father sign his name 4 times across the transfer documents, and I thought, he has no idea. Nobody in that room did. My father built his contracting business from nothing. He started in his late 30s with one truck, a nail gun, and a reputation for showing up on time. By the time I was in high school, he had 40 employees in contracts across 3 provinces. He was proud of that. He talked about it at every dinner, every holiday, every family gathering where someone made the mistake of asking how things were going. He would lean back in his chair and say, "I built something real." And he had. I'm not taking that away from him. What I am saying is that he always assumed my brother would be the one to carry it forward. I never understood why exactly. My brother dropped out of his business program after 2 semesters. He spent most of his 20s doing seasonal work, traveling, borrowing money from my parents when the travel ran out. He's charming. He's funny at parties. He has an easy confidence that people respond to, the kind that makes you assume he knows what he's doing even when he doesn't. My father responds to it too. He always has. I, on the other hand, joined the company at 22 with a completed finance degree and spent the first 3 years being handed tasks that an organized teenager could have managed. I reconciled accounts. I chased invoices. I caught a $40,000 discrepancy in our materials billing that our accountant had missed for 18 months. My father thanked me, moved on, and gave my brother a site supervisor role that same spring, even though my brother had never once swung a hammer professionally. I didn't say anything. I kept working. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes with being competent and quiet in a family business. You become the infrastructure. People don't think about infrastructure until it stops working. I ran the back office. I negotiated our equipment leases. I was the one on the phone with our insurance broker when we had a workplace incident in 2019 that could have cost us everything if I hadn't read the policy closely enough to know exactly what we were entitled to. My father never knew how close that came to going sideways. I didn't tell him. I just handled it. My brother, meanwhile, started showing up to the office more regularly around 2021. He had a new girlfriend by then, the one who would eventually be in that room clapping, and he'd apparently decided it was time to get serious. My father was thrilled. He started bringing my brother into meetings I had previously run alone. He introduced him to clients as the future of the business. He took him to lunch on Fridays. I watched all of this, and I kept working. I want to be clear. I wasn't sitting there quietly seething every single day. I had good days. I liked the work. I was good at it. But I noticed things. I noticed that when I presented the same financial projections my brother had summarized a week earlier, with less accuracy, my father listened differently. He nodded more slowly when I spoke, like he was waiting for me to finish. He lit up when my brother walked in. It's a specific kind of hurt, being overlooked by your own father. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. In the summer of 2022, my father had a health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but a chest pain episode that put him in the hospital overnight and scared us all badly enough that we stopped pretending we didn't need to talk about the future. I had that conversation with him directly, alone, while my brother was still driving in from Kelowna. I sat in the hospital room and I told my father everything I had been doing for the company, not as an argument, not as a demand. I just laid it out calmly so he would understand what the business actually ran on. He told me he was proud of me. He held my hand. He said he didn't know how he would have managed without me. 2 months later, he hired an outside consultant to assess the business with a focus on succession planning. The consultant spent 4 days reviewing our operations. I was the one who walked him through everything. I answered every question. I pulled every document he asked for. The final report recommended installing my brother as CEO. I read it sitting at my desk on a Thursday afternoon. I read it twice. Then I closed the file, drove home, and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. And then I made a decision. I'm not going to pretend it was a purely rational calculation. Part of it was anger. Part of it was something older and more tired than anger. A recognition that if I waited for my father to see me clearly on his own, I would be waiting for a very long time. I had given the company 12 years. I had the skills, the knowledge, the track record. And I had something else too. I had been meticulous for years about documenting my contributions. Every major decision I had influenced, every contract I had negotiated or reviewed, every crisis I had managed quietly, invisibly, while everyone else was at lunch. I called a corporate lawyer I had worked with during a vendor dispute 2 years earlier. Her office was in Calgary. I asked her to help me understand my options. What followed was 8 months of very careful, very private work. The business was structured as a corporation. My father held all the voting shares. But over the years, certain things had been deferred. Bonuses I hadn't taken, a loan I had made to the company in 2020 when our line of credit was maxed out and payroll was 2 days away, intellectual property I had developed, a project management system I'd built from scratch that the whole company ran on. These weren't huge things individually, but they were real, and they were documented. My lawyer helped me convert those deferred compensations into a formal shareholder agreement. It took time. It required my father's signature on documents he didn't look at closely, which I know sounds worse than it was. They were documents he had been putting off signing for years, things his own accountant had flagged as overdue. I wasn't hiding them inside something else. They were exactly what they said they were. He just didn't ask questions. Maybe he should have, but he never did with me. By the spring of 2023, I held 51% of the voting shares in the company. I didn't tell anyone. My father announced his retirement at a family dinner in March. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table and said he'd been thinking about it for a while, that he wasn't getting younger, that he was ready to hand things over. He looked at my brother when he said it. My brother's girlfriend squeezed his arm, and they smiled at each other. I ate my salmon and I said congratulations. The formal transfer was scheduled for a Tuesday in April. My father's accountant had drawn up the documents, a full transfer of his remaining shares to my brother, which would have made my brother the majority shareholder of record. They booked a notary's office downtown. They invited my father's longtime business partner to witness. My brother wore a new suit. I wore what I wear to the office every Tuesday. I had told my lawyer to be present. I said it was routine, that I liked having legal representation at any major transaction involving the company. Nobody questioned it. She sat at the far end of the table with a yellow legal pad and a water bottle, and she didn't say anything for the first 40 minutes. My father signed, the notary stamped. My brother shook our father's hand, and then his girlfriend's, and then the business partners. He looked at me and said, "We'll figure out a new role for you, don't worry." I remember the sound of the traffic outside. Someone's phone buzzed. My lawyer set down her pen. She said she needed to flag something before the transfer was finalized. She said she had reviewed the corporate registry that morning and there was a discrepancy that needed to be clarified for the transaction to be legally complete. She slid a document across the table, a certified copy of the shareholder register, which she had requested from the corporate registry office in Edmonton 3 days earlier. It showed that 51% of the voting shares had been held by me since July 2023. My father looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at my lawyer. He looked at me. My brother said, "What is this?" My lawyer explained it quietly and without drama. She said that the transfer my father had just signed was for his remaining 49% of shares, which he was fully entitled to transfer. But that transfer would make my brother a 49% shareholder, not a majority owner. The voting control of the corporation had rested with me for the better part of a year. My brother's girlfriend said, "That can't be right." My lawyer said it was correct and that the documentation was available for review. My father asked me when this had happened. I said, "The shareholder agreement was executed in July. Your accountant had copies. It was registered with the corporate registry in August." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." There wasn't a scene. That's the part people might not believe, but it's true. My father didn't raise his voice. My brother didn't flip a table. There was just a long silence, and then the notary said quietly that she would need to amend the transfer documentation to reflect the actual share structure, and my brother's girlfriend started gathering her coat. My brother looked at me across the table. I don't know what he expected to find there. Guilt, maybe, apology, some version of the accommodating sister he'd always assumed I was. I looked back at him steadily. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I worked for this. For 12 years. I documented it and I protected it and I compensated myself for it, legally with documentation that was available to anyone who thought to look." He said I had manipulated the process. I said he had never once looked at a corporate document in his life until today, when he thought one was going to make him rich. My father said my name, just my name, quietly, like a question. I turned to him. I said, "Dad, I love you. I've always loved you. And I have spent 12 years holding this company together while you made plans that didn't include me. I didn't take anything from you. I earned what I have. Every piece of it." He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. My lawyer began preparing the amended paperwork. My brother and his girlfriend left before it was finished. My father's business partner, who had been completely silent throughout, caught my eye on his way out and gave me a small nod. I had worked with him for a decade. I think he understood more than he let on. My father stayed. We didn't talk about the business. We sat in the notary's reception area while my lawyer finished the documents, and he told me about a fishing trip he was planning for the summer. I asked him where. He said somewhere north of Thunder Bay, a place his brother used to take him when they were young. I said that sounded nice. It did sound nice. The paperwork took about 40 minutes. When it was done, I signed where I needed to sign, and my father signed where he needed to sign, and the notary witnessed it. And that was the end of the meeting. In the parking lot, my father hugged me. It was a long hug, longer than usual. He didn't say sorry. I wasn't sure I needed him to. What I needed, I had already made sure I had. The weeks after were strange. My brother stopped coming into the office. He sent me a long text message about fairness and family loyalty that I read once and didn't respond to. His girlfriend posted something vague and pointed on social media that I'm sure was directed at me. I didn't engage with any of it. What I did was run the company, same as always. There were a few things that needed to be formalized. My title, my signing authority on bank accounts, my role with our insurance broker, and our bonding company. I had been doing most of it already, but now I did it with my name on the right lines. The employees didn't seem particularly surprised. A few of the ones who had been around long enough told me quietly that it made sense. One of our project managers, who had worked with us since before I graduated, said, "Honestly, I was wondering when this was going to happen." My father called me about 3 weeks later. We had dinner. He was quieter than usual. He asked me how things were going, and I told him, and he listened in a way he hadn't always listened before. I don't know if it was guilt or respect, or just something shifting between us finally after years of it being stuck. Maybe all three. He asked me at one point if I had been planning it for a long time. I thought about that. I thought about the hospital room and the consultant's report, and the Thursday afternoon I sat at my desk and read my own erasure on a page. I thought about 12 years of showing up and doing the work and watching someone else be handed the narrative of it. I said I planned it after I understood that waiting wasn't going to get me anywhere. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something and decided not to. We finished dinner. I drove home. The city was quiet that night. The particular quiet of a Tuesday in spring in Calgary when the snow has mostly gone, but it hasn't quite decided to be warm yet. I parked and sat for a minute with the engine off. I thought about the first time I had set foot in that office, 22 years old, carrying a binder. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning to prepare for a meeting that turned out to have been canceled. I had driven 40 minutes each way, and no one had thought to text me. I had gone in anyway and spent the morning learning the filing system. I had been figuring it out ever since. I went inside, I made tea. I answered 3 emails that had come in during dinner, because the work doesn't stop. In the morning, I had a company to run. I've thought a lot about what my father looked like in that moment, staring at the shareholder register, reading my name where he expected to see my brother's. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man trying to locate something he was certain he'd left on the counter, only to realize he'd never put it there to begin with. That's what happens, I think, when we assume the future will look the way we imagined it without ever checking whether our assumptions were actually true. I don't tell this story to make my father look foolish or my brother look small. They're both more complicated than that, but there's something in this that I keep coming back to, something that took me a long time to understand clearly enough to say out loud. What happened in that notary's office wasn't luck, and it wasn't cruelty. It was the result of 12 years of choices, mine and theirs, playing out to their logical end. My brother made the choice, year after year, to coast on charm and assumption. He assumed the business would come to him because it always had before, because our father's attention had always moved in his direction, because he'd never been given a reason to believe otherwise. That's not entirely his fault. The expectations were raised inside of have a way of feeling like facts, but he also never asked what it cost. He never looked at a single balance sheet. He never stayed late, or came in early, or sat with something difficult until he understood it. He received without contributing, and he assumed that was a permanent arrangement. My father made the choice to see what he wanted to see. I don't say that bitterly. I've made peace with it, more or less. He loved both of us. But love that isn't paired with real attention can do quiet damage. He watched my brother and saw potential. He watched me and saw competence, which he treated as a given. The way you stop noticing a foundation once you've built a house on it. The house stands. You stop thinking about the foundation. And I made choices too. I chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. I chose to document, to learn, to understand the company so completely that there was no version of its future that didn't include me. I chose to stop waiting for recognition and start making my position undeniable through legitimate, legal, documented work. That wasn't manipulation. That was integrity. Doing the right thing for the business, protecting it with real effort, and making sure my contribution was properly accounted for. There's something I want to say clearly, because I think people sometimes read stories like mine and conclude that the lesson is be cleverer than the people trying to push you out. But that's not quite it. The real thing I learned is this: doing honest work over a long time with clear eyes and careful records is not passive. It's a form of power. Intelligence without ethics is just calculation, and calculation without follow-through is nothing at all. What actually changed the outcome, was the combination. I understood the business deeply, I behaved with integrity throughout, and I didn't quit when quitting would have been the rational thing to do. Those three things together are what I had on my side when I walked into that notary's office. My father called last week. We talked for almost an hour. He told me about his fishing trip, and I told him about a new contract we'd just signed, and somewhere in the middle of it we talked, carefully, about the past. He said he wished he'd seen things differently. I told him I was glad we were talking now. That's not nothing. In fact, it might be the most important thing.